One Last Step. A Tara Mills Mystery, Book 1, Chapter 9. Tara stared at the man in the interrogation room. He sat in front of her, hunched over, sitting awkwardly in his seat, his eyes transfixed on the floor beneath him. Warren had just asked him his name, and his reply only confirmed what they already knew. He said, Greg Davis, the same name of the man on the surveillance camera. Tara's stomach tightened into a knot as Warren continued to ask a series of questions. Normally, Warren would have let her start the questioning, but they hadn't shared a word since they left the cabin. When they walked into the room, Warren had already opened his mouth without even glance at her. It was as if she was only a shadow, and she cowered in his presence like a light upon her. Warren pulled out pictures of the 3 victims, slapping them down one by one on a table in front of the suspect. Do these individuals look familiar to you? He said. The man reached out his hand and pulled the pictures closer for a better look. He stared at them briefly before pointing at the first 2 victims and shaking his head. His eyes then moved to the 3rd, and he slowly picked up the picture as a look of confusion crossed his face. Her. I met her at the camping store, he said before staring at the picture for a moment longer. What exactly is this all about? He asked as he looked up at Warren. The man genuinely looked puzzled, and it stirred Tara's gut instinct that this wasn't the killer. She wanted to step in, but as she glanced at Warren, whose gaze lay focused on the suspect, she knew it would be wiser just to stay quiet. Warren ignored his question as he leaned over the table. He placed his finger hard against the picture in the man's hands. He said, How did you meet her? The man sat a bit further back in his chair, cowering at Warren's approach. She was looking for a water jug, he responded flustered. Warren demanded, What else? The man suddenly pushed up his sleeves from the intense heat of nerves. Look, it was brief. I told her she could find one for half the price at the convenience store down the street. And what about after? What happened after you helped her? Warren was now inches from his face. What do you mean? That was it? The suspect threw his hands up in frustration. Warren suddenly backed off a bit and did let out a sigh. This woman, he started as he pointed aggressively at her picture. She showed up dead not long after she talked to you. A look of shock flashed across the man's face. He looked up, narrowing his eyes. Are you accusing me of murder? Heat rose to the surface of the skin as he grew angry at realization. He threw his arms up again. This is ridiculous. Did my wife put you up to this? Warren scrunched his face as though confused. And why would you think that? The man looked from Warren to Tara, scanning their faces, and then let out a sigh. I don't know. Maybe because she's the only one who knew that I was staying in the cabin. How else would you have found me? He muttered something angrily under his breath. What was that? Warren asked as he leaned in his ear a bit closer. The man repeated, I said I wouldn't be surprised if that woman tried to pin something like that on me. She probably found out about Sherry, he said, referring to the lady staying with him in the cabin. He crossed his arms. I swear I had nothing to do with it. Check the convenience store. You'll see I'll tell him the truth. As Tara listened to his answers, her gut feeling only intensified. The man who sat in front of them wasn't who they were looking for. Warren asked, "Then why did you run?" The man sat quietly for a moment and then spoke. "Well, you saw the fight me and Sherry had. I don't know, I thought she called the cops on me." Tara and Warren stood outside the interrogation room, looking in at Greg Davis through the one-way mirror. They stood silently, in awkwardness, swirling around them until Tara couldn't take it any longer. She said, "So what do you think?" Warren's gaze stayed on the suspect. "I'm not sure. He's clearly aggressive, but he looked a bit too surprised when he realized why we were questioning him." "I agree. We should check the convenience store." Warren nodded. "Yes, we'll ask the sheriff to send some cops over to take a look, check the cameras." He paused as the phone rang. He reached into his pocket and checked the caller ID. Tara could see it was the medical examiner. They had been anxiously awaiting the results for the bows and arrows they brought in, and Tara knew it could only mean that they were ready. Warren put the phone on the speaker. "So what did you find?" A woman's voice came through. "I'm sorry to say, but that's not the murder weapon." Warren's face fell, but it only confirmed what both he and Tara already felt in their gut. "How do you know?" "Well, what you found were conventional compound bows, not crossbows. And a compound bow wouldn't have caused the wound found in the victim. A crossbow has more power and it's deadlier." Warren paused. "And what about the arrows? Could they have been used with a crossbow?" The lady on the phone said it's very unlikely. The suspect's arrows were designed for a compound bow, so they are longer. They wouldn't have fitted properly in a crossbow. Warren did let out a big sigh before thanking her, hanging up and turning to Tara. "Well, we'll still see if your story checks out, but I think we should call it a day and get some rest." Tara nodded, but Warren still stood in front of her. He was still waiting for an explanation of what happened at the scene. He then spoke. "So, are you going to ever tell me what happened back there?" Tara knew she couldn't really avoid it anymore. She had to say something. "Look, I'm really sorry, Warren. I just froze. It won't happen again, I can promise you that." Warren narrowed his eyes. "The problem, Mills, is that it shouldn't have happened once." "I know, Tara tried to save herself, but Warren just shook his head and continued. "You need to get it together. This can't happen again. Do you understand?" Deeply ashamed, Tara nodded as she waited for him to say more, to ask her why she froze. But instead he turned to the door and left the room. Tara stood alone and turned her gaze toward Greg Davis, wondering if her inner demons would prevent her from seeing this case through.